Begin. Very good. So as everybody's settling in, I will, first thing over here, I'm starting to load up and I have several more chapters to, at least two more chapters to put on this and whatever and whatever documents I can come up with, throw onto this. Again, it's, pardon me, every morning it's week two. So to me, week two means exam two. So, and I haven't decided whether I'm going to do it in class or do it, we'll see, uh, pre-recorded style to do the review material. But I do have everything set and it's going for that because it's a week from today, the exam. So we'll take that all into account. Maybe I'll try to get that out this afternoon if I do the recording, if I'm ambitious. And I'm not that ambitious. Okay, moving on. So we're sort of flip-flopping a little bit because I'm used to the illustration from this Nestor PowerPoint 5, but I happen to like this chapter in Cowan from a standpoint that I like the way it's presented somewhat graphically. So I'm going to try to amplify both of these as it all comes together. So we'll take it from there. Oh, did you notice that number? 14? I don't like that. Every time I have a morning like this, one word comes to me. Florida. Why am I here? Sorry. For my whole life in the Northeast. The whole life. But I digress. All right, off we go. So we'll start with the Cowan power, which does it very, very nicely. So this is chapter 9 for your viewing pleasure, physical and chemical control of microbes. A little introduction last time that you were, and the last time we were there on Monday. And it basically, first part is definitions. The definitions that are important are the ones we'll be going over today. Those things like sanitization and that kind of stuff. Again, governmental terms are different. I mean, they're relevant, but and there's some type of things that you'll become, depending on what fields you're going into. It's much bigger today. And everything changed, you all know, post-COVID. And they even allude to this in the PowerPoints because this edition came post-COVID effectively. They added enough COVID material that it just made people much more sensitive to what's going on with regard to these kinds of things. And this is really what we see, okay? We're much more cognizant of somebody sitting in a classroom and somebody starts to cough. It's also, you're much more sensitive to that today, whether you've been vaccinated or not. That's really what's the interesting part about taking micro now, as opposed to now, because we have a much greater context. Because most people saw somebody either get very sick or tragically have lost somebody during this, during the COVID environment. And certainly that's going to be with us. And and a lot of people ask me the same question. Effectively, what's going to happen, we're seeing consistently now in the winter, and whether or not it's a year-round phenomenon or not, we're going to see 3 respiratory viruses that are continually going to be on us. And that's influenza, which has been around since time immemorial. COVID, as it continues to mutate, influenza is mutating. And we're seeing a real uptick in RSV. And we'll get to all of those when we do the viral unit, which is part of this second unit. So we want to define sterilization. These are ones I went over. Not so much decontamination and sanitization. Again, be aware of those terms, and depending on what your role is and wherever your workplace is, you need to be aware of what your expectations are. Antisepsis, degermination, I don't know where they came up with that term. No, let's see. We'll look at the degrees of resistance, endospores, prions, sort of leading the list. Very important terminology that's going to follow us. Cidal versus static. When something is cidal, like homicide, it kills somebody. Okay? Side means to kill. It's different than static, which means just to interrupt, slow down, or temporarily limit the growth cycle. When you put something in a refrigerator, you're effectively bacteriostatic. you're basically arresting the growth cycle to or slowing it down highly significantly so it can stay in there. It's a really important term. And if you think it's important now, wait till you see it when we start talking about antibiotics. Because the biggest single determining factor, short of doing a gram stain or knowing if someone's allergic, is whether or not it's bactericidal or bacteriostatic. And we're, for us, for somebody who orders those drugs over the years, cidal is the winner. That's always going to win, if possible. For categories of targets, they're going to talk about the cell wall and the cell membrane, and they're going to talk about ribosomes, and they're going to talk about genetic material, and that's not a big deal. I don't really look at these too much as to what they affect. Most of them work on either destroying the cell wall or denaturing proteins, and there's other aspects that go in, but it's not a big deal. Controlling our degree of exposure to potentially harmful microbes, monumental concern. I don't know if I couch it that way, but so the methods of microbial control, and this does not include antibiotics. We're not talking about antibiotics, antibacterials, antivirals, antifungals. We're going to really group these into two major categories: physical and chemical methods. Heat, a variety of the chemicals you use every day, whether you're wiping something off with alcohol, whether you're washing your hands, whatever you're doing. Sterilization, disinfection, decontamination, sanitation. I've never called antisepsis degermation. I suppose. Here we go. Sterilization. Process that destroys or removes all viable microorganisms, including viruses. Okay. Strictest sense to refer to materials that have been subject to this particular process. Okay, it's either sterile or it's not. Slightly, it's like being a little bit pregnant. It doesn't work. Okay. Kind of look at it that way. General reserve for inanimate object. Not generally, it is. Okay, you can't, if you sterilize parts of the body, you're killing them. So we're going to look at those things. We're going to look at them in detail and the different ways that we go about doing it. And things that you're going to, and for many of you, you're going into a health or a clinical field, you wear a lot of hats. Okay. In my office, we did almost all of our own sterilization. We did 90% of our procedures in the office. We sterilized everything. I had a little sterilizer, not so little, okay, comparatively, not like a hospital unit. So I have a lot of experience, and I'll share that with you with regard to that. Disinfection. It's not normally, it is used on inanimate objects. It's about the concentration, utensils, bleach solution. I don't know about immersing thermometers, and I suppose you could take that. But bleach, perhaps less so. Iodine, heat, yes, always is going to play a role. Heat, we're going to talk about those things. Mechanically to reduce to safe levels. And again, that's a governmental decision. And so if you're in the food industry, this becomes significant to you. If you're at home, certainly becomes significant to you. Okay. And antisepsis, okay, on skin, on living tissues. And it's a fine line. To me, when you're talking about washing your hands, and as I look through the PowerPoints, it's much more about mechanical action. There's a lab that you may or may not do. I'll even talk to Doctors Dress and Holwig and see if they'll do the lab just to humor me, which they might, where we use a combination of, you either use soap, no soap, bar soap, pump soap, okay, that type of thing, or the kind of soap that's used to scrubbing for surgery. And you want to see what the difference, and you use Purell or those other alcohol things. So you use, and basically what you find with that is mechanical action, which to me is a physical method of control. It's assisted by water for the most part, with the exception of those, Purell or alcohol-based hand sanitizers that are ubiquitous now. I love that. That's the best thing about what happened with COVID. It's like now, as you're walking down the hall, if you have somebody, they gravitate to those things. You watch somebody doing this, they're walking around. It's like, oh, I like that person. Clean. My mom and dad say clean hands and a pure heart, and I was halfway there. It's up to you to guess which half. This PowerPoint has this table, and I love it. I'm sorry. Here's mechanical. To me, mechanical is really physical. Okay, but I'm going with it. Okay, physical agents, basically two: heat and radiation. Heat, as you will see, can either be dry or moist. We can do what you do in the lab when you flame a loop. You've been flaming your loops, I take it, in the lab. Isn't that fun? You're incinerating. That's sterilization. Dry ovens. Hey, you got one at home. You can sterilize at home. Yes, you too can sterilize at home. That's right. Moist heat. This is what we use the most. Steam under pressure versus boiling water, hot water, or even pasteurization, which are not forms of sterilization, just disinfection. Notice that when it comes to heat, this is how we sterilize. Radiation, which we'll examine more closely, particularly ionizing radiation. And what we use a lot of are gamma rays, and they can sterilize, versus non-ionizing radiation, ultraviolet, which is a form of disinfection. Okay, and I'll have to show it to you. I just put, if you're interested, we just put one up on eBay. It's like a little hand foldable ultraviolet sanitizer, which I'm sure doesn't work at all. But if you're willing to pay $60 for it, I'm happy to sell it to you. You don't want to do that? Oh, I'll get that. I'm getting that for you guys next time. Let's see what it is. Chemical agent. I don't. We found it at home. I don't know where we got it. Chemical agents. We spend a whole day looking at these, and they are defined as either gases or liquids. And if you take a look, you could have gases that sterilize, and we use a ton of them. Effectively, we use poison gas. Okay? And liquids, particularly bleach, and you'll notice that the only way we can utilize them in the form of sterilization is on inanimate objects that are there. And this is the interesting one. To me, mechanical removals, I think filtration is probably the best example of that we use. And the air is what you utilize most certainly in a hospital sense. You can do this, you can filter liquids, and you can, depending on what you're trying to filter out, you can, and this is classically when they like utilize, like say beer, and they use cold brewing techniques, you can filter out the microbes with that, theoretically. That's, and I don't know a great deal about that, but you can see here the definitions: disinfection, destruction, removal of vegetative pathogens. That means we're not looking at endospores. Usually only on inanimate objects. Sterilization, all viable microorganisms, inanimate objects. Antisepsis, ignore that other term. Surface on body surfaces, read that as skin. And when they talk about these, mechanical removal of most, whatever most means. So we have to look at sort of the degree of resistance and some of the basics behind this. So the basics behind, I mean, there's things that we do in everyday life, whether you're washing your hands, you're cleaning up the kitchen, or you're doing the dishes, that to us are fairly routine, because we're trying to avoid, principally, I would think more than anything else, foodborne illness, those kinds of things. And foodborne illness is a big problem. I alluded to it before a little bit. So back when I first started teaching micro, which is about 20 years ago, in 2003, right here, good old Beaver Falls, PA, there was a restaurant chain that was already in bankruptcy, by the way, called Chi-Chi's. And you can still buy like Chi-Chi's salsa in any grocery store you go to, that Chi-Chi's brand. So, but the restaurants were already failing with regard to that. And oh boy, and what happened, they utilized for garnish, whatever you want to call them, green onions, scallions, spring onions, any of those names apply. And the way we get them, and this is, people always misinterpret, is typically if you go to Walmart, you get a packet that's sealed. It'll have like a half dozen or so of those in there. I'm going to say product of Mexico. Most of them do come from Mexico, to be fair. It doesn't matter where they came from. We all treat them the same way. You have to power wash them. You pick them, they're out of the ground. You have to power wash them just with high velocity water to clean off the dirt and surface material. And there was a failure somewhere along the line to do this. That played a role in it. And Subsequently, what happened, they were contaminated with a virus called hepatitis A. Hepatitis A in the old days was called infectious hepatitis, and it's a what we call fecal to oral spread. Okay, and when we get into viruses, we'll hear about that, and we will revisit the hepatitis A. What happened was, if they had cooked these, if you use them as a base, like you do in a lot of Asian cuisine, green onions chopped up are a base along with garlic and ginger. That's part of the flavor base component. I cook. Just saying. Okay, but when you use it for garnish, you're not cooking it. And what happened was people became contaminated. 1,000 people in this area, people who had, because it was right off the turnpike, the exit. The exit now, the Beaver Falls exit up there, whatever the old exit 2, was all of those folks. We had about 4 people die, and they weren't all like very old or very young. It just depended on their health. That was really a very significant illness, and we didn't have a lot of sophisticated ways available then to treat it. They could only use something called gamma globulin at that time, which is just a super dose of sort of generic combination of antibodies, which are in the category that you'll learn about in AB2 called gamma globulins. So it gives you an idea of how easily this can be a problem. So I just want to kind of set the stage for that, to understand that full foodborne illness can be a real player. So primary targets are microorganisms capable of causing infection or spoilage, because that certainly has economic consequences. Mixtures of microbes, lots of differences. Endospores traditionally have been considered the most resistant. Again, the prions are more resistant. We just don't have enough information to formulate specific numbers. Okay, so the goal of sterilization is the destruction of bacterial endospores. And when we get into the nuances of it, you'll see that's the way hospitals have to verify or validate in that way that they have controlled that. Because there's no more important place than in a hospital doing that. Because when you're operating on somebody, you sterile instruments. Period. So any process that kills endospores gets everything else. And here's the pecking order. The prions, again, as far as we know, most resistant, misfolded proteins, whatever that means. But these are the ones we know about. Bacterial endospores, most difficult. And we went over that whole thing with endospores. It's very important for the first exam. Protein coats, exosporiums, cortex, all that good stuff. I mean, it's a hard nugget that's really hard to penetrate. So you have to use extreme heats or extreme radiation or extreme chemicals to get to deal with it. Mycobacterium, they're the ones that have that thick, waxy capsule made of mycolic acid, a very thick fatty acid. Staphylococcus everywhere. And something, if you're going to work in a hospital, you're going to become alarmingly familiar with. It's a soil bacteria that effectively is now everywhere. Pseudomonas. And what makes Pseudomonas such a pain in the neck is it's very hard to find antibiotics. Very hard. And the antibiotics that are available are not easy to deal with. It's not like you can just give somebody a thing of Keflex and say, here, takes care of Pseudomonas. Protozoan cysts. Okay, not all protozoans form them. The ones that form cysts are very difficult. That's well water contamination. Versus the trophozoites, which are the more active form, a little easier. And then bacteria, fungal spores. And as you'll notice here, non-enveloped virus, gram-positives, and enveloped viruses. The gram-negatives a little harder, that outer membrane, a little harder to penetrate. That's there, so it's a little bit more resistant. This is a significant difference. Non-enveloped, which we were going to learn are called naked viruses, do not have this fatty layer envelope that makes it comparatively easy target. Voila. So they give you an interesting table here. Typically, to destroy endospores, is moist heat at or around 120 degrees Celsius. Roughly, if you want to do the conversion, actually the number is 252 degrees Fahrenheit. The number is 121 degrees Celsius. That's the classic number for sterilization. So at 100, and effectively you're using a pressure cooker. 121 degrees Celsius, which is the equivalent of 252 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly for 15 to 20 minutes. Yeah, it varies. I always used to do my stuff in the office for half an hour. Might as well make sure. Okay, that type of thing. Typically, I think I will never put both of those on an exam, be one or the other. And when it accomplishes that, the pressure that is obtained in the device, which effectively is a pressure cooker. That's right. You could use your Instant Pot at home. You have an Instant Pot? It's a great website. It's called Pressure Luck, all one word. And the guy's crazy, and he's so good. He used to be in the food industry. That's his YouTube channel. It's great. 15 psi, 15 pounds per square inch. He's got a chili recipe to die for. So radiation, whatever, how grays are basically looking at the amount of exposure, and grays is a term. We used to use something called Röntgens. Gas, we'll talk about ethylene oxide, and we'll talk about glutaraldehyde. So it's gaseous and liquid sterilization. Notice the times. That's a big number, and that number is pretty low. Okay, comparatively, most authors will tell you 6 to 10 hours, not 3 hours. So for vegetative forms, only 80 degrees Celsius, less radiation, not nearly as much gas, and certainly not a whole lot of exposure to liquid. And so when they want to categorize how resistant endospores are, particularly so for radiations, they're trying to look at that. So bactericides, chemicals that destroy bacteria except for those in the endospore stage. That would be a sporicide. Fungicide, fungi, spores, hyphae, viricide, viruses. They're using the appropriate terminology. Inactivate. Viruses are not alive. So, I mean, and you're going to hear, we'll go over this at length, versus you hear a lot of people say live viruses and vaccine. It's sort of we as individuals think of things that are alive or dead. They're not looking at scientific definitions of something that by definition not a living thing or an organism. So active and inactive are the appropriate terms. Okay, and then any of these agents that have the ability to kill microorganisms, whether a large amount or a limited amount, we call them collectively germicides or microbicides that are there. And so when we look at things, when stuff is growing where it shouldn't be growing, sepsis. And the whole idea, and that's why we use the term aseptic technique versus sterile technique. Sterility, and you'll see in one of the slides said that too. It's very hard for something to stay sterile. I mean, if you are in an operating room, think of the most sterile environment you're probably going to encounter. And you have a table that has a sterile drape that you put on there sterilely or aseptically. And you opened up a pack of instruments, you've got about an hour of that sitting on that table before effectively that's contaminated. You don't have a lot of time. Because the air itself is by no means sterile. Relatively speaking, it is. At least for that juncture in time, or the field that you're working on is sterile. When you're operating on somebody or you're participating in it, and obviously I'm speaking to people who are going to go into those kinds of fields, you have a limited space. It's called the sterile field. It's approximately the width of your body. It's between your shoulders and roughly your belt line or your waistline, your belly button, if you want to think of it that way. Okay? So if you do this, you're out of the sterile field. You're contaminated. You do that, you're contaminated. Do that. Can't do any of that. Your glasses start to slip, too bad. Hopefully somebody will help you and push them back on. That's the way it works. So you have a very limited area that you have to be very concentrating on. Okay, no 5-second rule. In our house, we don't have to worry about that. The dog has the 5-second rule covered. What are we having tonight? Oh, we're having burgers. I'm so happy. He was a happy dog last night. Oh, thanks, guys. I didn't get you anything. So, practice in healthcare. And so they talk, and so really sterile methods, but if you appropriately, I would call it aseptic technique. Again, the warning for those in the nursing department: do not say we're doing a sterile dressing change at bedside. No, Don't say, Dr. Stein said you're just using aseptic technique. You can put it on me if you want. It's okay. I'm with you. Where's your cadre of friends, Sophia? What did I do? Did I offend everybody? Nobody, no, they don't love me anymore. The dog loves me. Somebody has to. Antiseptics, we'll get into those. Directly applied to wounds and surfaces. You use them all the time. Surgical incisions don't work necessarily that well with that. We'll talk about why we use iodine before root canals and hydrogen peroxide, hand washing with germicidal show. So static, prevent the growth of bacterial tissues on objects. Fungistatic fungi, microbistatic, generically speaking, microbials. So it's all about how it's used, and that's really what we're going to get into. Nowadays, we used to use a lot of this category, semi-criticals, preferably sterilized. The classic example, if you're familiar with them, are endoscopes. Endoscopy is when they take effectively a tube and you're passing it down your alimentary canal, typically into your stomach, esophagus, stomach, and small intestine. So its classic name is esophagogastroduodenoscopy. The other way is colonoscopy. Okay. So you're not technically entering the body because you are protected by multiple layers of mucous membrane that are there. So what they used to do in between procedures you would soak them in a high level disinfectant for about 40 minutes. What happens now, because people were concerned, and there was actually an incident that occurred in Pittsburgh area where someone, the tube was sterile, but the ports, they have sterile ports that are supposed to be actually sterilized, were used for brushings or washings or biopsies. And they were contaminated by somebody who was HIV positive. This happened about 20 years ago. I was in my early days of teaching micro, because I had a lady in my class who at the community college, I was doing it, who worked in the GI lab at Jefferson Hospital. It didn't happen there, but everybody heard about that. And so the liability alone would be scary. I don't know that anybody got terribly ill, but it was a big deal. Now, and they might even have it in this slide sequence, it's like a suitcase system. You buy what you had to do for the company to guarantee that wasn't going to happen. You had to buy their sterilizing system, etc. Nowadays, all the hospitals do it. It's like a suitcase. You put the thing in there. They actually, as you'll see, will use hydrogen peroxide based system to actually sterilize everything in between patients. But they used to have two sets. The procedure would take about 40 minutes, and you'd have one set, and while the other one was being used, you'd be cleansing that one. That's kind of how they did it. So, it wasn't unusual to have a GI specialist do 10 or 15 of those in the morning in a hospital. It takes about half an hour. That kind of a thing. That was what semi-criticals are. Non-criticals are easy. Okay. Blood pressure cuff, stethoscope, maybe a device for temperature that you're just putting on the surface. Nothing to it. These days, critical means it's going to come in contact with sterile tissues. So sterile tissues is everything that is either on the skin or has mucosal lining. And they, by definition, have to be sterile. So most people err on the side of caution to make sure that everything is sterile. Obviously, if you're going to be listening to somebody with a stethoscope, most of the time, you're lucky if somebody decides to wipe it off with something. Most of the time they don't. We walk around, you have to put it around your neck so you look cool. Right? That thing. We shove them in our pocket. Okay. This is interesting. Okay. Things that require sterilization. Okay, situations requiring sterilization confront persons involved in healthcare. Nothing works for everything. Some things are chemical sensitive. Some things are heat sensitive. Some things get dull. Not me doing the lecture. Okay. Anybody? You're so stoic this morning. Cost, effectiveness, contamination, environmental concerns. There's a ton going on. The number one thing is when you're going to sterilize something that's not a disposable. We use a ton of sterile disposables. The paper, the gowns and the gloves and the drapes and things like they're all paper products that we throw away anyway. But what do you do with an instrument that's been sitting inside of somebody? You have a retractor. You have a pair of pickups. Those things are expensive. Okay, you have hemostats, which really just we call clamps. Okay, which are just clamps that can lock, and most of you are familiar with what they look like. Those things are expensive. A cheap one's $100 because you're going to buy the ones that are made out of stainless steel and the ones that are made in Germany because they make the best precision instruments. Okay. It's not even, and nothing's even close because they last the longest. Specialized scissors, needle holders where you put sutures in, $500. These generally have carbide inserts. They're generally gold plated. You can't throw those away, but they get a bunch of yuck on them, organic material, blood, mucus, tissue fluid, fatty materials. The single most important thing that you have to do before you sterilize them, whatever means you're using, clean them off. Because that stuff cakes on. You think of what happens when you put something in, how many times you put something in a dishwasher that you didn't kind of pre-wash or do something with, and it had like eggs or cheese on it. What happens? It cakes on. You know, it's like I do this in the restaurant. You ever get a fork in the restaurant that kind of sketchy? I don't wait. I have another fork. I've only been thrown out of a couple of restaurants. You can get away with that. Okay. See, my wife now, she loves that. My first wife was horrified. Her comment was, "What will people think of me when you do that?" And I go, "Tell them you're married to an asshole." It's okay. Okay. So that's the idea. Number one, hit parade. So I cooked that up from this other PowerPoint sequence right there. Dirt, grease, body fluids interfere with heat penetration or chemicals. Clean everything. Microorganisms in biofilm are more so if it's on there and it cakes and it becomes a film, harder. Temperature and pH. Bleach can kill tuberculosis at 55 degrees Celsius. It's not a big number, maybe 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and half the time it's 50. And it's more effective in acidic environments. That just gives you, it gives you an idea of what we're talking about. Here's the critical, semi-critical, non-critical nugget. Composition. Some plastics, irradiation is an alternative. People are frightened by it. They think they're going to glow. Moist heat, liquid chemical disinfectants, moisture-sensitive problems. And a lot of important surgical instruments get dull. So if you're up in the anatomy lab, like with me, and if we're doing the heart dissection, which we may be doing today, I try to make sure that you have a sterile blade on there that I put on because I don't want you guys to cut yourself. Those blades come in foil packets. If you look at the foil packet, and this is every blade in the hospital has the same way, it says sterilized, guaranteed sterile by gamma radiation. The handle, whether it's a number 3 or a number 4 handle, which are the two most commonly used handles in a hospital, those you put into an autoclave with a whole bunch of other instruments and sterilize them. Okay, but you use a new blade every time. And it's not, and you use a half dozen blades in surgery because they're easy to put snap on and off. They're very, very easy. That's the way that system works. So and I'll go back and look at that in a second as we get back to the other PowerPoint, just to give you an idea. Okay. Microbial death. Okay. Well, it's permanent. We knew that. Permanent loss of reproduction, even under optimal growth conditions. Yeah, fine. I'll buy that. We kill them. More. Sleeping with the fishes, 6 feet under. Taking a dirt nap. They're dead. Godfather. Don Corleone, we got to make him dead. Death of the whole population is not instantaneous, so it's a threshold. Remember the growth curve? We spent Monday looking at the growth curve. There's a death curve. So what they do scientifically is you imagine having an amazing amount of microbes, and what do we need to do to make sure they're dead? And then we overdo it effectively. So there's just like there's a growth time or a growth rate frequency, there's a death rate frequency. And that, so you don't have to do any calculations or that. Logarithmic manner, okay? Active cells die more quickly than less metabolically active cells. Eventually, a point reached at which survival of any cell is unlikely, and that's how they determine 15 to 20 minutes. Okay, you have taken a reasonable amount of endospores that you could never encounter in real life, and make sure that they're gone. That's basically what happens. So, the higher the load of contaminants, the dirtier it is, the more contaminated. The nature of those organisms. Typically, it's a mixture, so you have to anticipate it's going to be a rather substantial mixture, and of course, temperature and pH. So we know different doses, so higher concentrations, whatever the appropriate wavelength that's there. We want to know how it works. Interfering organic matter, saliva, blood, feces can inhibit the action of disinfectants, even of heat. So it's just that thing when you get it out of the dishwasher and you got something that's caked on there. Hey, I'm gonna have to do it again. The dishwasher alone, it's a pot scrubber dishwasher. I don't buy it. In our house, we go to the dishwasher. It's just clean or dirty, but you don't know something ucky in there. These are the targets. I don't get too excited about that. So, cell wall, membrane, DNA, RNA, proteins. Those are the four general areas that you'll see. So, cell wall agents, chemicals, detergent, alcohol, you don't really have to recall which is which. Alcohol and detergents particularly work well on cell membranes. That's why alcohol works on what are called enveloped viruses on your skin. Not for long, but they do work. We'll look at cell synthesis, interrupting the synthesis of proteins. Again, these are very, very strong agents that are all inherently sterilants. Proteins, moist heat, alcohol, again, works on some of the proteins, though limited. Phenolics, which is a very useful, that's the one that Lister worked with. So here, and they're showing you some of these mechanisms of action. So this was interesting. And this is when we really started COVID-19 alcohol-based hand sanitizers, okay, have really had a big boom in the COVID-19 era because they were efficient comparatively. It's like when you're in the hospital, they really have made a big change in what's happened today. For years in the hospital before they became somewhat ubiquitous, and this was before COVID. It was just hand washing. And hand washing has its limitations because your hands can suffer, particularly if you're using relatively strong soaps or doing them frequently. As you get older, your skin has a tendency to dry out. Okay, comparatively, it does. And if you're fair complected, it has a tendency to dry out faster. My first wife, who was hardly, and I think I told you guys who had that, had me in AMP1, that she got, and she was iron with a BS, and all she did was wash her hands. Her hands were so torn apart that she had to wear gloves. The dermatologist treated because you can only wash your hands 3 times a day. Other than that, you have to wear gloves more of the time. So I mean, you can overdo it. The reason I mentioned that to you vis-a-vis skin is to understand that that's your friend. The health of your skin, if you're going to be in a field that requires that, or any field, is so important. When you have breaks in the integrity of the skin, you're much more at risk. Before we could operate, they had inspected our hands. A lot of surgeons said, show me your hands. Because if you had a nick or a cut, not only were you at risk, but you theoretically could put the patient at risk. And I mean, so you were, first thing you did. So enveloped virus, its envelope was susceptible to detergents and alcohol. It's antisepsis, who cares? The 6 methods, heat. So we'll get into the heat here big time. Why do we use moist heat versus dry heat? The problem with dry heat, very simply, it does not penetrate. It doesn't do very well, and it really limits. If you wanted to dry sterilize an instrument, you could take a sheet pan, but you use a cookie sheet, crank your oven up to 400, single, you can't stack them. They have to be separate and not touching, because the touching of the metal to the metal will not allow the heat to penetrate sufficiently. And so maybe you put them on, make it easy, on a silicone pad or a piece of parchment paper. Okay, and you probably have to leave it in there for an hour and a half. It takes a lot of time, and you have a very limited available amount of space. That's the big problem. It's time, and time is money when it comes, particularly when you're doing it commercially or in a hospital sense. And two, okay, is the fact that you can't have a whole lot in there with regard to the volume of things you're going to sterilize. If you see them sterilized in a hospital, they take a container, and they probably have some illustrations of it. It's made out of like stainless steel. It's got holes in it, and you just, once the instruments are washed up, you stuff them all in there. Because when you're using moist heat, those are superheated molecules of steam that get, when metal's touching metal, they have no problem getting in between. That's the beauty of moist heat, why we use it so much. So elevated temperatures, the higher the better. Lower temperatures, maybe a more microbistatic. Moist heat, so hot water, boiling water, steam, etc. Dry heat, 160 degrees. Most authors will tell you around 200, which is about a 40-degree oven, and obviously a lot higher. Dry heat in the form of a flame that you're using in the lab to sterilize a loop is considerably higher, like 500, 600, 700, whatever it is, whatever the flame is. So where we start with this is all started from our friend Pasteur, roughly 62 to 63 degrees Celsius. Again, it's about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about the internal temperature of your dishwasher. So what you're doing, you're not sterilizing your dishes, you're pasteurizing. And pasteurization is a form of disinfection. It has no effect whatsoever on endospores. It's not hot enough by any stretch, and it's just not going to work on those kinds of things, because we'll get into why this works and this doesn't, for roughly 30 minutes. That's called the batch method, pasteurization. And the big problem with that, again, if you're going to get, again, it was adopted by the wine industry, if you're going to get vintage wine that costs an extraordinarily large amount of money, I don't drink, so I don't know, and how much that is. I drink socially. I'm going to a wedding this month. I'll have a drink. Is this? Again, it's not commercially acceptable. It's too long a period of time unless you have a very high-end item. So what happened over time was they raised it to roughly about 72 degrees Celsius, and they found that in a matter of 15 to 20 seconds, if they could hold the heat there. So this was called the high temp short time method, pasteurization. And again, we're talking about effectively moist heat. Water, if you want to immerse it in that, whatever's inside your dishwasher. They also found then, if you increase it, some things didn't work as effectively, things that had a high fat content. So when you see pasteurization of ice cream, of heavy cream, sour cream, that type of stuff, which you look at it, it'll say pasteurized on it. They have, for fats, they increased it up to about 82 degrees for about, again, another 10 degrees was necessary. Something you're going to see which is not the same, which is much closer to sterilization, is called ultra pasteurization. And that involves superheating a liquid that can tolerate that, roughly 140 degrees Celsius for about 3 to 5 seconds. And what we use, then we put it in a specialized container that has been pre-sterilized by another rapid method using, interestingly, what we call vapor phase hydrogen peroxide. So when you get a juice box, when you get, you go to Sheets and they have those little things you can pop open, the little creamers you might get in a restaurant, things like that. Those are ultra pasteurized. Interestingly, when they're sealed, they're shelf stable. You don't have to shove them in the refrigerator. And that's a whole other nugget about things like that. We are, in this country, we are in love with refrigerators. How many people do you know that don't have one of those big refrigerators, the French doors, the big thing? We have one you could swim in. It's too big. It sticks out about 6 inches in the house. We're sorry we got it. Okay? It's huge. Okay. If you go in Europe, most of the refrigerators, even if you go into, are going to be refrigerated like you might have in your dorm room, maybe a little bit bigger. Because first of all, they buy every day for what they're cooking, and only when they open it up do they put it in the refrigerator. I mean, the eggs are left out at room temperature and things like that. Scout's honor. Cheese is a room temperature food, if you didn't know. It tastes best there. Just saying. So those are, and we'll get more to the ultra pasteurization. So it's not the same. Ultra pasteurization implies that it's a sterile environment that's heat stable. So it's an unusual thing in and of itself. It's not something we would do for things we use in a medical sense whatsoever. Moving on. Almost done. Moist heat operates at lower temperatures and shorter exposure times. Coagulation and principally denaturing proteins. Dry heat dehydrates the cell, denatures the proteins, oxidizes. That's when you're putting it into a flame like that. So they're just showing you what different kinds of shape changes and active sites, and I don't really care. And these are the numbers. Okay, moist heat, 121 degrees Celsius, roughly 15 minutes, typically accepted. This is an interesting procedure, and we'll conclude with this slide. Sometimes an item, you'll be in an operating room and an item will go off the field. It'll still have won't have been contaminated per se. And you do something called flash sterilization. So a circulating personnel or circulating nurse, they will have a special sterilizer that they can put it in 134 degrees for 3 minutes. And let's say it's a specific retractor or a specific instrument that you're doing and normally have an abundance of instruments. Every so often you only have one. And you can see dry heat a whole lot different. As you crank up the heat, you get closer to 400, and you can do it in about an hour. Let's stop there, and we'll pick up and get into the specifics of how it works and how we look at it and then these death times and things like that. Thank you.